Hey everyone, this is a video on section 4.10, economic growth and/or economic development strategies, with a focus, of course, on developing countries. We'll start by looking at trade strategies. So firstly, import substitution. We've got a definition here, but it's when countries, they try to start producing the things that they formerly imported. So instead of paying other countries to make them, they try to make them themselves. The benefits that have been seen of this have been jobs, or the perceived benefits, jobs, diversifying their economy so they're not reliant on all of their money coming from a narrow set of goods. We've seen that before in previous slides. But this didn't really work. So this was tried pretty hard by countries in Latin America, as we've got highlighted on the map there. So what can happen is that in order to replace the imports, you've got to put in place trade protection so that the imports are, too expensive to buy and that the local people will buy the locally produced goods. So we know how that leads to resource misallocation. So allocative inefficiency, we can see that in a trade diagram. We know how to do that. It does require some heavy government intervention if it is to be done properly. You're going to have to heavily invest in these industries, and it's the government picking winners, which doesn't always work that well. So there can be some resource misallocation there as well. And also there's a lack of competition. If we eliminate the imports by putting up really high trade barriers, then these newly developed industries within the country, they're not exposed to competition, which means they might not be as efficient as possible, which again leads to some resource misallocation. And another problem with this strategy is that it's restricted to a domestic market. So what you are producing now, it's only really designed to be sold within that domestic market. And in these developing countries, the domestic market for goods isn't that big. So it prevents these firms growing to a scale sufficient enough to become efficient. This isn't a necessary aspect of this, but the history of Latin America found that agriculture tended to be a bit neglected in this process. So they actually had to import food. And that was part of the balance of payments problems that they had. Firstly, they had to import all the capital equipment. They had to import more food. And they often this import substitution was done by multinational firms. So they had to send those profits back overseas. And of course, these firms weren't efficient enough to be able to export. So we didn't have exports. So a lot of money going out, not much money coming in, balance of payments problems. So it was really abandoned by the 80s, except for selected industries. So it wasn't found to have worked on an economy-wide scale, but supporting particular industries can help, as we've seen with infant industries, that argument. Next, we'll look at export promotion. So achieving economic growth through expanding exports. This was found to be much more successful. It was done to a great deal of success by what we call the 4 Asian tigers. So South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong. So there they are on the map. And what it really was industrial policies to support export industries. The things that could be done: production subsidies, export subsidies. Remember, we know how to model both of those. Grants, and also tax exemptions to encourage the creation of those export industries. They also provided incentives for research and development into high-tech products. And what these countries often have produced are high-tech products. So they've really diversified their economies, and they are now high-income areas. It was also supported by large public investment in education skills, R&D, as we mentioned, transport and communication infrastructure. The transport infrastructure helps get the exports out and cheaply, so they are efficient and competitive on a global stage, and the communication infrastructure, again, to increase that efficiency and lower their costs of production. Very important that they do that. And they also maintained undervalued currencies. So of course, this makes their exports appear cheaper to their trading partners. So also did help, especially in those early stages when they were ramping up the efficiency of that production. Okay, why it worked? It was outward looking. That's compared to the import substitution. It was selling to foreign markets. That they could sell to the rest of the world. So they are allowing for huge economies of scale. And they did do it in a gradual way, gradual diversification. So they went from simple goods like textiles, moving away from your agricultural goods to simple goods, to eventually complex goods requiring skill and technology. But they'd made those investments, so they were able to make that step. The investments in human capital, of course, and they increased employment by using labor-intensive capital. That's quite important to get the whole economy involved. Great for development, of course, people in jobs, and that really helped that export promotion strategy. And they didn't have balance of payments problems because they were exporting so much that the export revenue paid for the capital imports. So they might have had to import machinery and technology, especially early on. There are some risks in doing this. You can develop a dependence potentially on exports. For example, if you are exporting to one country in particular, a recession of that trading partner can be quite painful. There's a dependence on low wages, potentially, because that maintains the competitive advantage. And if you've got those low wages, does everyone in the economy actually benefit from the strategy, or do you have just a working poor, perhaps? A trade surplus. I don't know if you can hear my dog whinging, hopefully not. A trade surplus can cause tension with other countries. So we've seen that with Donald Trump. He was quite upset that China had such a trade surplus with the US, that they exported more than they imported from the US, and that caused tension, and they had a trade war about it. Okay, another trade strategy is economic integration. So regional trade agreements are thought to be quite useful here. So what it does is it increases the market size of any one company within the regional trade agreement. So instead of just having people from their country buy it, they've got people from lots of other countries buy it. So they can get economies of scale, and these trade agreements should lead to increased investment. So they're going to be much more attractive for foreign multinational companies to come in, because they know they can produce and sell without trade protection to all these other countries. So that will be attractive to them. The countries would now have an incentive to cooperate on trade infrastructure. So thinking road and rail, access to ports, because they're working together, they're on the same side. Water and energy supplies as well would be useful for them. It does tend to work better when the markets are of similar sizes, because the trade is more likely to be fair. There's not one dominant partner in a much more powerful position to be able to extract the best deal for their own country. In terms of bilateral trade agreements, if we're talking agreements between developed and developing countries, these tend to be a little less successful for growth and development. Sorry, that's my dog again. What they do is they provide access to the developed country market so they can sell cheaply to that market. However, and this is a negative, you can see by the cross I've put there, local firms may not be able to compete with imports from the developed country. So some of the benefits some firms might gain, but a lot might get hurt with this. And what also happens is it sounds like a decent deal if it's just one country with one country. But the more countries that sign FTAs with the developed country, let's say the US, the less benefit each developing country receives, because they're less likely to buy exports from that one country because there's all these other countries to buy exports from. And they tend to have weaker bargaining power. I spoke about that just before. Another strategy is diversification, increasing the variety of goods and services produced and or exported by a country. So the over-specialization is usually in primary production. They've got one good that they're abundant in, one resource that they're abundant in. We saw a lot of countries, it's oil. Might be one other primary product. And that's quite risky because if the global price of that falls, they're in trouble. So what they can do is start producing higher value added production. So if they're rich in cocoa, what ideally they would do is develop the industries to turn that cocoa into chocolate. If they've got iron ore, they would develop the industries to turn that into steel rather than selling the raw materials and then buying back the chocolate and the steel. So the idea is that can grow exports. Demand for primary goods tends not to actually grow that much as incomes rise. They've got low income elasticity of demand, so therefore it's not a great source of growth in the long term. What you can get from this, a great variety of production, more employment opportunities, new manufacturing industries, higher skill and technology. So this can sort of start to seep into other industries as well. And importantly, it avoids the volatility in export revenues. Another strategy is to support social enterprise. This is a type of commercial organization that aims to achieve particular social goals in an effort to improve people's well-being, so development really, and promote social change. I'll give you an example. A firm called Bambike in the Philippines. It's bikes made out of bamboo for the most part. So what it is built sustainably with fair labor. They use builders from poor communities and they provide scholarships and food programs. So supporting industries like this that really give back to the community is a great way for countries to achieve development. And I think that will do for this part because we're up on 13 minutes now. So we'll continue this shortly.